The rain was coming down in sheets when the call came, the kind of heavy, freezing downpour that made the whole city look like a blurred watercolor painting. I was in my bedroom, checking the zippers on my leather bag, preparing for a flight to Chicago that was supposed to secure my partnership at the firm. I had spent 15 years grinding for this moment, sacrificing sleep, relationships, and my own peace of mind to prove I could make it. When my phone lit up with my brother's name, a familiar weight settled directly into the center of my chest. Before I could even get a word out, his voice cut through the speaker, dripping with that casual, unearned authority he always used when he wanted something. "You need to take the boys this weekend," he said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for discussion. "I already paid the driver and they're on their way to your place right now, so do not even start with the excuses about work." I did not raise my voice, because after years of this exact pattern, I had finally run out of anger to waste on him. I told him no, keeping my voice as flat and steady as a dial tone, reminding him that I had rejected this request twice already. "Do not let that driver drop those kids off at my gate, because I am literally walking out the door to catch a flight." He laughed, a short, dismissive sound that made my skin crawl, before telling me that the kids would just wait on the porch until I decided to stop throwing a tantrum. What he failed to realize was that the porch he was referring to did not belong to me anymore. I had sold that suburban house 4 months ago, packing up every memory of my old life to escape the constant, uninvited invasions from my own flesh and blood. I had bought a high-rise apartment downtown with security guards and fob access elevators, keeping the location entirely to myself, so I could finally sleep without worrying about who was going to show up demanding a favor. He was still operating under the assumption that I was the same reliable, guilt-ridden sister who would always bend to his will. But the man living in my old home now was a retired military officer who did not care about family obligations, and that single misunderstanding was about to set off a bomb. The tension between my brother and me had been building for as long as I could remember, rooted in a family dynamic where he was the golden child, and I was the safety net. My brother, Marcus, was 36, exceptionally handsome, wildly irresponsible, and completely convinced that the world owed him a comfortable living. His twin boys, Leo and Carter, were 9 years old, sweet kids who spent most of their lives walking on eggshells because they never knew which version of their father they were going to get. Marcus and his wife, Sarah, lived in a constant state of self-created chaos, treating their mounting debts and marital struggles as temporary inconveniences that everyone else was obligated to help them solve. That particular weekend, they had decided they desperately needed a couple's retreat at a mountain resort, and they expected me to provide free childcare so they could save their marriage. I had anticipated the manipulation, which is why I had explicitly warned Marcus in our family group chat the previous evening. I wrote out a clear message stating that I was traveling for business, that I no longer owned the suburban property, and that sending the boys there would constitute child abandonment. My mother immediately chimed in, accusing me of being heartless and selfish, while my father sent a message telling me that family always comes before a paycheck. Marcus simply sent a thumbs-up emoji, followed by a text saying he knew I would do the right thing when the kids arrived. Looking back, I realized that was the exact moment the final thread of my loyalty snapped. I took screenshots of the entire conversation, uploaded the files to a secure folder, forwarded them to my personal attorney, and walked out to my waiting ride. While my driver navigated the pre-flight traffic toward the terminal, Marcus posted a picture of himself and Sarah holding champagne glasses in the airport lounge. The caption read, "Off to relax while the best aunt in the world watches the kids." He was setting the stage, creating a public narrative to pressure me into compliance, assuming that once the boys were on the doorstep, I would abandon my career to avoid looking like the villain. The old version of me would have ordered the driver to turn the car around, crying the entire way back while apologizing for causing a scene. But that version of me had died the night Marcus used his emergency key to host a rowdy party at my house while I was out of town. I returned to find red wine stained into my hardwood floors, a shattered heirloom vase, and a family that told me I was being dramatic because Marcus needed to decompress. Shortly after that, I sold the property quietly to an older veteran named Richard Vance, a man who valued his privacy even more than I valued mine. According to the rideshare driver's subsequent statement to the authorities, Marcus had appeared frantic and annoyed when he loaded the boys into the vehicle. He handed Leo a single backpack, ignored Carter's tears, and told them both that their aunt was just playing games and would open the door if they knocked loud enough. The driver had questioned whether an adult was actually home, but Marcus assured him everything was fine before speeding off toward his own flight. Leo and Carter arrived at my former residence just as the sun was setting, the cold rain soaking through their light jackets as they stood before a locked gate. The porch looked entirely unfamiliar to the boys, the colorful flowers and welcoming atmosphere replaced by a stark, heavily secured entrance with security cameras. They rang the bell repeatedly, their shivering hands knocking against the heavy wood until Richard Vance finally opened the door. Richard did not raise his voice or frighten the children. Instead, he brought them inside, wrapped them in warm blankets, and immediately dialed emergency services. He reported that 2 young children had been left on his property by parents who knew the previous owner had relocated months ago. That was the variable Marcus had never factored into his equation. He expected a dramatic family confrontation filled with tears and eventual submission, but instead, he got the police and child protective services. By the time his flight landed, 2 patrol units were parked in Richard's driveway, and an investigator was already questioning the rideshare driver. My attorney had already sent the complete group chat transcript to the precinct, establishing a clear, documented timeline of Marcus's prior knowledge. I was sitting in a high-floor boardroom in Chicago, reviewing final contract details, when my phone began to vibrate continuously with incoming calls from my parents. I ignored every single notification, choosing to keep my focus entirely on my presentation until the meeting concluded, and my phone displayed a local police department number. I stepped into a quiet alcove and answered, speaking with an investigator who asked me to confirm my current address and my availability for childcare. I answered his questions truthfully, emailed him my flight itinerary, the deed of sale for the house, and the screenshots of my explicit warnings to my brother. The investigator thanked me for the documentation, his voice turning incredibly grave as he informed me that they were officially treating the incident as criminal neglect. Hearing those words made my stomach twist, because despite my anger toward Marcus, the boys were entirely innocent in this disaster. I had to ask myself if my refusal to save my brother made me responsible for the trauma his children were currently experiencing. But I knew deep down that if I stepped in to shield him this time, I would only be enabling him to put those boys in even greater danger in the future. By the time the evening flights landed, Marcus and Sarah were met at their destination airport by local Port Authority officers who escorted them to a holding area. Marcus tried his usual routine, smiling and claiming it was all a ridiculous family misunderstanding, but the officers were not interested in his charm. They showed him the printed text messages where he acknowledged my departure and stated that I would open the door anyway. Sarah began to weep, realizing the gravity of the situation, while Marcus sat in silence as the reality of his actions finally began to register. I booked the red-eye flight back home that night, not to assist my brother, but to ensure that Leo and Carter had someone looking out for them. My attorney met me at the station the next morning, handing me a folder containing the official reports and warning me that my parents were waiting inside. As soon as I entered the lobby, my mother cornered me, her eyes red from crying as she demanded to know how I could do something so terrible to my own brother. She did not ask about the boys or how long they had stood in the freezing rain. Her only concern was preserving Marcus's reputation. My father joined her, his voice low and threatening as he instructed me to tell the investigators that I had simply forgotten our arrangement. He wanted me to fabricate a story, to claim that a last-minute schedule change on my end had caused the entire mix-up. I looked at my parents, realizing for the first time that they were willing to make me a criminal accomplice just to keep Marcus from facing the music. When I refused, my mother spat that I was a cold, selfish woman who cared more about a career than her own blood. My attorney quickly intervened, reminding my father that pressuring a witness inside a police station was a serious offense that would only worsen their situation. Through the glass partition of the interview room, I could see Marcus looking disheveled, his expensive vacation clothes wrinkled as he glared at me with pure hatred. He shouted through the opening, accusing me of ruining his life, but I simply held up my phone displaying his own messages. He had built his entire life on the assumption that his actions would never have consequences, and that illusion had finally shattered. The emergency custody hearing took place the following afternoon in a sterile, brightly lit courtroom that felt entirely devoid of human warmth. Leo and Carter were not present, having been placed in temporary foster care, a detail that weighed heavily on my conscience. Marcus and Sarah sat with a court-appointed representative, while my parents sat directly behind them, trying to project the image of a respectable, grieving family. The state attorney presented the evidence methodically, showing that Marcus had knowingly abandoned his children at an address where he knew no guardian resided. My parents then made a formal request for temporary custody, delivering a rehearsed speech about their stable home and their desire to keep the family together. My mother wept on cue, claiming they had plenty of room and the financial means to support the boys during this difficult time. My attorney stood up, presenting the property records showing that my parents had actually lost their home to foreclosure 2 years prior due to bailing Marcus out of debt. I had secretly purchased the property back then and allowed them to live there rent-free, a fact they had never discovered until that very moment in court. The judge stared at my father, asking him to explain why he had just claimed under oath to own a home that was registered to my corporation. My father stumbled over his words, his face turning a deep shade of crimson as my mother gripped the wooden bench for support. My attorney then played a voicemail my father had left me the night before, in which he told me to take the fall because Marcus had a family to protect. The judge denied their custody petition on the spot, citing financial instability and attempted witness tampering. Marcus lost his composure completely, screaming obscenities at me until the bailiffs physically restrained him and forced him back into his seat. The judge hammered her gavel, stating that Marcus had destroyed his own family the moment he used his children as pawns in a game of chicken. Temporary custody of the boys was awarded to my cousin Clara, a quiet, sensible woman who had distanced herself from our family's toxicity years ago. I walked out of that courthouse feeling an incredible sense of relief, realizing I was finally free from the burden of carrying everyone else's mistakes. 3 weeks later, the criminal proceedings finalized Marcus's fall from grace, as the local media had picked up the story of the parents who abandoned their kids for a vacation. He lost his job at the brokerage firm, his professional credentials were suspended, and Sarah filed for divorce shortly after securing a plea deal. My parents were forced to find a small apartment after I served them with an eviction notice, choosing to cut ties with me completely rather than apologize. I visited Leo and Carter at Clara's home a month later, watching them run around a spacious backyard that felt safe, warm, and entirely free of tension. Leo showed me a birdhouse he was building, his hands steady and his smile genuine for the first time in as long as I could remember. I knew they still had a long road of healing ahead, but they were finally in a place where they did not have to worry about who was going to abandon them next. I had set up a trust fund to cover their education and therapy, ensuring they would always have the resources they need to build a real future. My brother sent his kids to a stranger's house in the rain because he believed my guilt would always make me open the door. He was wrong, and the consequences of his arrogance had landed precisely where they belonged, leaving me with nothing but my own hard-won peace. Sometimes the most painful boundaries are the ones that save your life, and I had finally learned that saying no did not make me a bad sister. It made me free.